The waitress handed the vampire king his forged immigration papers with a flawless Romanian accent. But what she whispered next, "This document is fake," made his ancient heart stop, because no mortal had ever risked their life to save his before. Elena's fingers trembled as she set down the coffee pot, her whispered words in perfect Romanian still hanging in the air between them. The vampire king's pale eyes locked onto hers, and she saw something shift behind that ancient gaze, a flicker of surprise that made her stomach clench with terror and an inexplicable surge of protectiveness. She had recognized him the moment he walked through the glass doors of Café Europa, his otherworldly stillness, and the way shadows seemed to bend around his shoulders, marking him as clearly as a neon sign to someone with her training. Elena Popescu had spent 3 years in Bucharest working for Romania's Departamentul de Supraveghere Supernaturală, learning to identify supernatural beings by their tells, their documents, their desperate attempts to blend into human society. She had fled that life, burned her real papers, and created a new identity as a simple waitress in Seattle, but some instincts never died. The immigration documents spread across his table bore the seal of the Department of Supernatural Affairs, but the eagle's wing angles were wrong, the paper stock too glossy, the signature block positioned 2 millimeters too high. Elena had forged enough documents herself to know perfection from fraud, and these papers would get him killed. The vampire king, Alexander Dracul, according to the false name on his documents, had been coming to America for asylum renewals since before she was born, trusting a system that had apparently decided to betray him. She glanced toward booth 7, where 2 men in identical gray suits sat nursing cold coffee, their eyes tracking every movement Alexander made with the patience of predators. Agent Morrison's steel-gray hair caught the afternoon light filtering through the cafe's windows, his surgical scars visible when he lifted his cup, while his partner, Agent Chen, kept one hand resting near his jacket pocket in a way that suggested concealed weapons. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Elena knew their type, had worked alongside men just like them who saw supernatural beings as problems to be solved rather than people to be protected. Her own illegal status made her vulnerable. Her knowledge of supernatural classification protocols made her dangerous, and her sudden decision to save a vampire king made her a traitor to the very government whose false papers had given her sanctuary. The irony tasted bitter as old coffee grounds. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for her order pad, tearing off a sheet and sketching a quick map of the kitchen's back exit while writing in Romanian script that they were being watched. Alexander's fingers brushed hers as he took the paper, his skin cold as winter stone, and she saw recognition flare in his expression as he read her warning. 30 seconds, she had written, knowing that Morrison and Chen were already rising from their booth, their movements casual but purposeful as they approached his table. The vampire king's 800 years of survival instincts warred with what looked like bone-deep exhaustion, the weariness of someone who had been running for far too long. Elena made her choice in the space of a heartbeat, lifting a full tray of dishes and stepping deliberately into Morrison's path. The crash of breaking porcelain and the splash of hot coffee created exactly the chaos she needed, both agents instinctively moving to avoid the scalding liquid while Elena apologized profusely in accented English, playing the clumsy immigrant to perfection. In her peripheral vision, she saw Alexander rise and move with inhuman grace toward the kitchen, his form seeming to blur at the edges as he slipped between the scattered tables and concerned customers. Morrison's eyes snapped to the empty table where his target had been sitting, his face hardening into fury as he realized what had happened. Elena continued her performance, crouching to collect broken ceramic, while her mind raced through the implications of what she had just done. DSA Protocol 7 was burned into her memory from her training days. Any mortal who provided aid to a supernatural target became classified as a compromised asset, subject to immediate detention and enhanced interrogation. She had just painted a target on her own back to save a creature she barely knew, driven by an instinct she could not name. The security cameras mounted in each corner of the cafe had captured everything, their electronic eyes recording her face, her movements, her obvious coordination with Alexander's escape. Elena's carefully constructed new life was crumbling in real time. 3 years of hiding undone by a moment of moral clarity that she already knew she would never regret. Morrison was speaking rapidly into his phone, while Chen examined the abandoned documents, their professional calm masking what Elena recognized as barely controlled rage. She finished cleaning the mess and retreated to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she washed dishes, and tried to process what came next. The Vampire King was gone, vanished into Seattle's maze of alleys and shadows, but Elena remained trapped in plain sight, waiting for the inevitable consequences of her choice. Her shift ended at 6, the ordinary routine of closing procedures feeling surreal after the afternoon's events. Elena locked the cafe's front door and walked to her beat-up Honda Civic. Her nerves stretched thin as she scanned the parking lot for watchers. The DSA business card tucked under her windshield wiper looked innocuous, just white cardstock with a government logo, but the handwritten note on the back made her blood freeze. Report to Federal Building, Floor 13. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. Come alone. Agent Morrison's precise handwriting was as cold as his eyes had been, each letter formed with mechanical precision that suggested a man who left nothing to chance. Elena sat in her car for long minutes, staring at the card while her mind raced through options that all led to the same dead end. Running would only confirm her guilt and trigger a manhunt she could never escape. Staying meant walking into a trap with her eyes open. Fighting was impossible against an organization with unlimited resources and legal authority. The note's simple command carried the weight of federal power behind it, an invitation that was really a summons that was really a death sentence wrapped in bureaucratic language. Elena started her car and drove home through Seattle's evening traffic, the business card burning like ice against her palm where she clutched it. Her small apartment felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge that Morrison knew where she lived, where she worked, probably where she shopped and how much money she had in her checking account. The Vampire King had thanked her with his eyes as he escaped, a gratitude so profound it had nearly broken her heart, but gratitude would not protect her from what came next. Elena double-locked her door and pulled the curtains closed, knowing that somewhere in the city, Alexander Dracul was also hiding, also planning, also trying to figure out how to survive another night in a world that wanted him dead. She had saved him once with a whispered warning and a moment of courage, but tomorrow she would face the consequences alone. The business card sat on her kitchen table like a small white gravestone, marking the death of Elena Popescu, the waitress, and the birth of Elena Popescu, the fugitive. Outside her window, Seattle's lights twinkled in the darkness, each one representing lives that would continue unchanged, while hers shattered into pieces she might never be able to reassemble. But when she closed her eyes, Elena could still see the Vampire King's face in that moment of recognition, the way his ancient features had softened with something like wonder when he realized she was trying to protect him. No one had ever risked their life to save him before, he had said with his eyes, and Elena understood with crystalline clarity that no one had ever been worth saving to her before either. The choice was made, the die cast, the trap sprung. All that remained was to walk into the Federal Building tomorrow morning and discover whether her gamble to save a monster had been worth destroying herself. Elena's laptop screen glowed in her darkened apartment as she scrolled through classified DSA protocols she had accessed using credentials that should have been deactivated years ago. Her former colleagues in Bucharest apparently too disorganized to properly scrub their systems. The statistics made her stomach turn. 97% success rate in asset elimination, with eliminated being the bureaucratic euphemism for murdered in ways that left no evidence and no questions. She had helped compile some of these numbers herself, back when she believed the work was necessary, before she learned that supernatural beings were not monsters, but refugees fleeing persecution that stretched back centuries. The false passport hidden beneath her mattress would never survive federal scrutiny. Her cover identity too shallow to withstand the kind of investigation Morrison could launch with a single phone call. Running meant abandoning everything she had built in 3 years of careful anonymity. But staying meant walking into a trap that would likely end with her body disappearing into the same statistical void that had swallowed hundreds of others. Elena closed the laptop and moved to her window, peering through the curtains at the empty street below, unaware that amber eyes watched her from the shadow of an oak tree whose branches cast geometric patterns across the sidewalk. Alexander Dracul stood motionless in the darkness, his supernatural senses tracking her movements while guilt gnawed at his conscience like hunger. 8 centuries of survival had taught him to trust no one, to leave no witnesses, to disappear at the first hint of danger. But something about the waitress had shattered those rules in a way that left him vulnerable and confused. She had risked everything for a stranger, shown him kindness when he had forgotten such gestures existed, and now his presence in her life would likely destroy her as surely as dawn destroyed shadow. The Vampire King knew he should vanish into the night, let Elena face whatever consequences came from her choice, preserve himself as he had always done, but the memory of her whispered warning kept him rooted to the spot like silver chains. For the first time in 300 years, someone else's welfare mattered more than his own survival, and the realization terrified him more than any hunter's blade ever had. Morning came too soon, gray Seattle light filtering through clouds that seemed to press down on the city like a lid on a tomb. Elena dressed carefully for her appointment with Morrison, choosing professional clothes that might help her project competence and value rather than guilt and desperation. The federal building rose before her like a glass and steel monument to bureaucratic power, its mirrored windows reflecting nothing while seeming to absorb the light around it in ways that made her skin crawl. Security screening took 20 minutes, metal detectors and document checks and questions about her purpose that felt more like interrogation than routine procedure. The elevator to floor 13 moved with hydraulic smoothness that suggested reinforced construction and soundproof walls, the kind of modifications that indicated serious government work happened behind those unmarked doors. Morrison's office overlooked Elliott Bay, its floor-to-ceiling windows providing a view that should have been beautiful but felt like a display case, as if she were being exhibited for some unseen audience. The agent himself looked smaller behind his desk than he had in the cafe, his steel gray hair perfectly styled and his surgical scars visible when he gestured with hands that had clearly seen violence. He explained Elena's value with the clinical detachment of someone appraising livestock, her Romanian language skills, and document expertise, making her uniquely qualified to infiltrate supernatural communities that had learned to distrust government agents. The deportation threat hung between them like a blade, Morrison's casual mention of her illegal status carrying the weight of absolute power backed by federal authority. Romania wanted her back, he explained with a thin smile that never reached his eyes, her former colleagues in the anti-supernatural task force eager to discuss her sudden disappearance and the classified information she had taken when she fled. Elena understood the implicit equation. Cooperation meant survival, while refusal meant a one-way ticket to Bucharest and whatever revenge awaited her there. Morrison's first assignment was elegantly simple in its cruelty. Locate Alexander Dracul within 72 hours and deliver him to a DSA extraction team using whatever methods necessary to gain his trust and lure him into their trap. Elena accepted the mission with appropriate reluctance, playing the role of a cornered asset who had no choice but to comply, while her mind raced through the impossibility of what she was being asked to do. The Vampire King had vanished into Seattle's shadows like smoke, and even if she could find him, betraying his trust would destroy whatever remained of her soul. Morrison provided her with a encrypted phone and detailed protocols for making contact, his instructions delivered with the mechanical precision of someone who had orchestrated hundreds of similar operations. Elena left the federal building with 69 hours remaining on her deadline, the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She drove home through afternoon traffic, checking her mirrors for surveillance vehicles while knowing that Morrison had resources far beyond anything she could detect or evade. Her apartment building looked the same as always, but Elena felt the difference the moment she stepped inside, an electric tension in the air that made the hair on her arms stand up. The Vampire King emerged from the shadows near her kitchen with fluid grace that seemed to bend light around his form, his presence both terrifying and oddly comforting after the sterile menace of Morrison's office. Elena's hand moved instinctively to the silver letter opener on her bookshelf, one of the few weapons that could actually harm a supernatural being, but her heart was not in the gesture. Alexander raised his hands in a gesture of peace, his amber eyes reflecting sadness and determination in equal measure, and Elena realized that he had come to surrender himself rather than let her face Morrison's wrath alone. The confession spilled out of her in a rush of words, Morrison's ultimatum and the deportation threat, and the impossible choice between betraying a vampire king or facing certain death in Romania. Alexander listened with the patience of someone who had survived 8 centuries of persecution, his expression growing darker as Elena described the DSA's tactics and Morrison's personal involvement in her recruitment. When she finished, the Vampire King moved to her window and confirmed what Elena had suspected. Her apartment was under surveillance, unmarked vans positioned at both ends of her street, and listening devices planted throughout her building. They had perhaps 10 minutes before Morrison's team realized their target had walked into their trap, and Alexander's supernatural senses could detect the electromagnetic signatures of equipment designed specifically for monitoring supernatural beings. Elena grabbed essential documents and what cash she had, while Alexander disabled the surveillance devices with surgical precision, his movements too fast for human eyes to track, as he neutralized threats she could not even see. The Vampire King's revelation came as they prepared to flee. He had been legally protected under the Supernatural Refugee Act of 1952, his sanctuary status renewed every 50 years through proper channels that had functioned without incident for 7 decades. Someone inside the DSA wanted him dead, not because he posed a threat, but because he possessed knowledge that could expose Project Census, a classified database containing detailed information about every supernatural being in North America. Alexander had worked briefly as a translator for the early Bureau of Investigation in 1923, memorizing portions of an early version of this registry before realizing the deadly implications of such comprehensive surveillance. The Vampire King's perfect memory had preserved names, locations, and weaknesses that could be used to hunt down thousands of supernatural refugees who had spent generations building new lives in America. Morrison was not acting on official DSA orders, but collaborating with private military contractors who wanted to sell this information to foreign governments, turning supernatural persecution into a profitable international business. Elena's linguistic skills made her valuable as a potential decoder if the full registry were ever recovered, but those same skills also made her dangerous to Morrison's conspiracy, since she might recognize the scope of the operation and expose it to legitimate authorities. Alexander offered Elena a way out of Morrison's trap, help him gather evidence of the corruption within the DSA, and he would use his connections in the supernatural community to secure legitimate asylum papers that would protect her from both American and Romanian authorities. Their partnership began in the cramped space of Elena's apartment as she taught him to recognize modern forgery techniques, while he shared survival strategies learned from 8 centuries of evading those who saw his existence as an affront to the natural order. Elena's expertise in document analysis, complemented Alexander's supernatural senses and encyclopedic knowledge of bureaucratic systems, their combined skills creating possibilities neither could achieve alone. The Vampire King led her through Seattle's underground tunnels to a sanctuary she never could have imagined, a renovated basement beneath the Romanian Orthodox Church of St. Nicholas, where Father Mihail had been protecting supernatural refugees for over 30 years. The elderly priest greeted Alexander with the familiarity of old friendship, and Elena with the kindness reserved for those whose courage had earned them a place in the Underground Railroad that smuggled supernatural beings to safety. The church basement contained a sophisticated communication center that intercepted and decoded DSA transmissions, revealing the true scope of Morrison's operation and the timeline they were working against. Elena learned that Project Census was not simply a database, but an active hunting program, with supernatural beings disappearing from their communities at an accelerating rate, as Morrison's team worked to eliminate anyone who might possess partial knowledge of the registry's contents. Father Mihail showed them intercepted communications indicating that the DSA planned to raid the church in 36 hours, half the time Morrison had given Elena to locate Alexander, suggesting that her mission had been designed to fail from the beginning. Morrison needed Elena to lead them to Alexander's hiding place, then planned to eliminate both of them to protect his conspiracy from exposure. The Vampire King's revelation about Morrison's family connections to the supernatural persecution industry going back 3 generations explained the personal nature of his vendetta and the resources he could access outside normal DSA channels. Elena's former colleagues in Romania were not cooperating with Morrison out of professional courtesy, but because they had been bought and paid for by the same private military contractors who wanted access to Project Census. The chess game had been rigged against them from the beginning, but Elena and Alexander now had 36 hours to expose the corruption and get evidence to authorities who were not part of Morrison's conspiracy. Father Mihail provided them with secure communications equipment and contacts within the Department of Justice who had been investigating supernatural rights violations. But reaching those allies would require Elena and Alexander to survive long enough to deliver evidence that Morrison would kill to suppress. The Vampire King's 8 centuries of experience in fighting systemic persecution, combined with Elena's intimate knowledge of how such systems operated from the inside, creating a partnership that represented the first real threat Morrison's conspiracy had faced in decades. Elena understood now that saving Alexander in the cafe had been more than a moral choice. It had been the first move in a war that would determine whether supernatural beings could continue to exist openly in America or would be driven back into the shadows by those who profited from their suffering. The timer was counting down toward a confrontation that would either expose the truth or bury it forever along with everyone who knew it existed. Elena's fingers moved through Father Mihail's meticulously organized archives with the reverence of someone who understood that history lived in documents, each yellowed page and faded stamp representing lives saved or lost in the endless struggle between those who hunted and those who sought refuge. The church basement contained immigration records dating back to the 1920s, when the first wave of supernatural refugees had fled the chaos of post-war Europe and sought sanctuary in America's emerging bureaucracy. Father Mihail had inherited these files from his predecessor, a priest named Father Dmitri, who had worked closely with government agents to establish the legal frameworks that would eventually become the Supernatural Refugee Act of 1952. Elena found the file she was looking for, buried between asylum requests from werewolf families escaping Nazi persecution and vampire survivors of the Russian Revolution. Alexander Dracul's original sanctuary petition from 1923, written in elegant Romanian script that documented his flight from Bucharest after a failed uprising against the boyars who had collaborated with his ancient enemies. The signature at the bottom of the approval stamp belonged to Agent Thomas Morrison, Immigration Bureau, and Elena's blood turned to ice water as she recognized the angular handwriting that matched the note left on her car windshield. the same distinctive formation of letters that had marked her death warrant just days before. Agent Thomas Morrison had processed Alexander's first asylum request, granting him legal protection that should have lasted indefinitely under the treaties governing supernatural refugees. But attached to the original file were photocopies of documents that should never have been removed from secure archives. Elena spread the copied pages across Father Mihail's desk, her document analysis training allowing her to identify them as portions of the early supernatural registry that Alexander had translated during his brief employment with the Bureau of Investigation. Someone had stolen these copies in 1923, and Elena's growing horror confirmed what her instincts had suspected. The current Agent Morrison was not the first of his family to profit from supernatural persecution. The revelation unfolded like a nightmare given form, as Elena traced the connections between past and present, discovering birth certificates and employment records that revealed 3 generations of Morrison men working within the federal bureaucracy with access to supernatural affairs. Agent Thomas Morrison had passed his knowledge and stolen documents to his son, Robert Morrison, who had worked for the OSS during World War II and later helped establish the Department of Supernatural Affairs in the 1960s. Robert Morrison had refined his father's methods, using his position to identify and eliminate supernatural beings who might possess dangerous knowledge while selling information about others to foreign intelligence services and private military contractors. The current Agent Morrison represented the 3rd generation of a hereditary conspiracy that had been profiting from supernatural persecution for nearly a century. His family's wealth built on the blood of those they were sworn to protect. Elena's hands shook as she photographed the evidence with Father Mihail's secure camera, understanding now that she had stumbled into something far larger and more dangerous than a single corrupt agent. The Morrison family had infiltrated the DSA from its inception, creating a shadow organization within the government that operated according to its own agenda while maintaining the appearance of legitimate law enforcement. Morrison's grandfather had stolen the registry fragments not for immediate profit, but as an investment in future opportunities. Knowing that supernatural beings would continue to seek refuge in America, and that their identities would become increasingly valuable to those who wished them harm. The scope of the conspiracy explained Morrison's resources and his confidence in operating outside normal DSA protocols. He was not breaking the rules, but following different rules entirely, ones established by his family decades before the current legal framework existed. Elena realized with crystalline clarity that Morrison's recruitment of her had nothing to do with her potential as an informant, and everything to do with her skills as a document forger and translator. The agent needed someone who could decode the complete registry if it were ever recovered, someone who could create the false documentation necessary to facilitate the international sale of supernatural location data. Elena's background in both supernatural identification and document creation made her the perfect tool for Morrison's plans, which explained why he had been willing to expend considerable resources to trap her rather than simply eliminating her as a security threat. Alexander appeared beside her with the silent grace of shadows given form, his amber eyes reflecting ancient sadness as he studied the evidence of the Morrison family's betrayal. The Vampire King had trusted the system that granted him sanctuary, renewed his papers faithfully every 50 years, believed that America represented a genuine refuge from the persecution that had driven him across oceans and centuries. Learning that his protectors had been his predators all along struck him with the force of a physical blow, the weight of a century's naive faith collapsing under the truth of systematic corruption. Elena showed him the photocopied registry pages, watching his expression change from sadness to fury as he recognized the handwriting he had produced in 1923, the names and locations he had translated in good faith, now revealed as merchandise in a market that traded supernatural lives for profit. Morrison did not want to arrest Alexander or even kill him quickly. The agent planned to extract every detail of the registry from his perfect memory through methods that would make traditional torture look merciful. The Vampire King's supernatural resilience meant he could survive interrogation techniques that would kill a human in minutes, providing Morrison with the time needed to recover information that had been scattered and hidden for over a century. Elena understood now that her role in Morrison's plan was to serve as translator and document forger during the extraction process, using her skills to verify information and create the false papers necessary to move supernatural prisoners between sites without triggering legitimate DSA oversight. Father Mihail's communication equipment crackled with intercepted transmissions that confirmed their worst fears. The church raid had been moved up by 12 hours, giving them less than 24 hours before Morrison's team surrounded their sanctuary. The urgency was not driven by Elena's failure to produce Alexander within the original timeline, but by intelligence suggesting that their investigation was getting close to exposing the full scope of the conspiracy. Morrison could not afford to let them gather more evidence or make contact with the Department of Justice attorneys who had been investigating supernatural rights violations. Elena and Alexander were no longer fighting for their individual survival, but for the existence of every supernatural refugee who had sought protection in America over the past century. The registry in Morrison's possession contained enough information to facilitate the systematic elimination of entire communities, and his family's connections throughout the federal bureaucracy meant that legitimate authorities might not learn of the genocide until it was too late to prevent it. The Vampire King's knowledge represented the final piece of a puzzle that the Morrison family had been assembling for 3 generations, the complete map to supernatural America that would allow them to monetize persecution on an unprecedented scale. Elena stared at the evidence scattered across Father Mihail's desk, understanding that she had moved from being a pawn in Morrison's game to being one of the few people capable of stopping him. Her expertise in document analysis and supernatural identification, combined with Alexander's encyclopedic memory and survival instincts, represented the only realistic threat to a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for nearly a century. The power dynamic had shifted in ways that Morrison could not have anticipated. Instead of recruiting a tool for his family's business, he had created enemies who understood his methods and possessed the skills necessary to expose them. Father Mihail provided them with additional evidence from his own investigations, decades of careful documentation showing patterns of disappearances and bureaucratic cover-ups that correlated with Morrison family activities. The priest had suspected the truth for years, but lacked the connections and resources necessary to challenge such a deeply embedded conspiracy. Elena and Alexander's arrival had given him the opportunity he needed to finally strike back against those who had perverted the sanctuary system he had dedicated his life to protecting. The Vampire King's perfect memory allowed him to correlate Father Mihail's evidence with his own experiences over the past century, identifying patterns and connections that painted a comprehensive picture of the Morrison family's operations. They had not limited themselves to supernatural persecution, but had used their knowledge and connections to profit from various forms of human trafficking, arms dealing, and intelligence brokering. The supernatural registry was simply their most valuable asset, the foundation for a criminal enterprise that had grown to international proportions while hiding behind the facade of legitimate government service. Elena realized that exposing Morrison would require more than simply presenting evidence to authorities who might themselves be compromised by the conspiracy. They needed to create an information cascade that would overwhelm the Morrison family's ability to contain or discredit their revelations, forcing multiple agencies to investigate simultaneously while ensuring that the evidence reached media outlets and international organizations beyond Morrison's influence. The plan forming in Elena's mind required precise timing and considerable risk, but the alternative was allowing a century of systematic persecution to continue indefinitely. Alexander's supernatural abilities and Elena's understanding of bureaucratic vulnerabilities could be combined to create maximum impact with minimal warning to their enemies. They had less than 24 hours to gather additional evidence, make contact with legitimate authorities, and positioned themselves to survive Morrison's inevitable retaliation. The Vampire King and the former government agent turned waitress had become the last hope for thousands of supernatural beings whose existence depended on preserving the illusion of American sanctuary while destroying the reality of American persecution. Elena looked into Alexander's ancient eyes and saw her own determination reflected there, the shared understanding that they were fighting not just for their own survival, but for the principle that some things were worth dying to protect. The Morrison family had built their fortune on the assumption that supernatural beings were powerless against systematic oppression. But they had never faced enemies who combined Elena's technical expertise with Alexander's centuries of experience in turning the weapons of persecution against the persecutors themselves. The morning news showed footage of Elena's apartment building cordoned off with federal tape, agents in tactical gear carrying boxes of evidence, while reporters speculated about terrorist connections and immigration fraud. Morrison had moved faster than they anticipated, his team raiding both the cafe and Elena's former residence within hours of her missed check-in, gathering every scrap of paper and electronic device that might reveal her movements or connections. Federal warrants had been issued under the Supernatural Security Act, a piece of post-911 legislation that allowed indefinite detention of anyone suspected of aiding supernatural threats to national security, effectively making Elena and Alexander enemies of the state with no legal protections or rights of appeal. Father Mihail watched the coverage from the church's hidden communications room, his weathered hands steady as he initiated evacuation protocols that had been decades in development, sending coded messages to safe houses throughout the Pacific Northwest that would shelter supernatural refugees until the immediate danger passed. The underground network activated like a living organism responding to threat, each cell operating independently while maintaining communication through encrypted channels that Morrison's team had not yet penetrated. Elena and Alexander moved through Seattle's shadows like ghosts, using the Vampire King's supernatural senses to detect surveillance, while Elena's knowledge of bureaucratic procedures helped them anticipate where Morrison's agents would look next. Every Romanian cultural center in the city was under watch. Unmarked vehicles positioned outside Orthodox churches, while plainclothes agents monitored Eastern European businesses with the patience of professional hunters. Morrison had cast a net designed to catch anyone with connections to their target demographic, understanding that supernatural refugees often clustered around familiar cultural touchstones that reminded them of home. The safe houses Father Mihail provided offered temporary sanctuary, but each location became compromised within hours, as Morrison's resources proved far more extensive than they had imagined. Elena realized with growing horror that her former colleagues from Bucharest's anti-supernatural task force were not simply cooperating with Morrison, but had been embedded within his operation for months, their expertise in tracking supernatural beings making them invaluable assets in a hunt that spanned continents. The Romanian agents knew Elena's psychological profile, her habits and preferences, and the way she thought under pressure, giving them advantages that mere surveillance could never provide. Morrison was not just hunting them through American channels, but had activated international networks that turned their flight into a global manhunt with resources that seemed unlimited. Elena learned of her homeland's involvement when intercepted communications revealed flight manifests showing 3 of her former colleagues en route to Seattle, their arrival scheduled for the following evening. Captain Radu Stănescu had trained Elena personally in document analysis and psychological manipulation, teaching her skills she now used against his own operation while knowing that he understood her capabilities better than anyone alive. Lieutenant Maria Costin had worked alongside Elena for 2 years, sharing night shifts and coffee and the casual intimacy of partnership that would make her betrayal feel like a knife between the ribs. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov had been Elena's mentor and almost her lover, their relationship ending only when she discovered the true nature of their work and fled Romania in the middle of the night. Morrison had chosen his reinforcements with surgical precision, selecting agents whose personal connections to Elena would make her capture feel like a family reunion orchestrated in hell. Alexander sensed the change in Elena when she learned about her former colleague's arrival, her fear transmuting into something harder and more dangerous as she realized that running would never be enough. The Vampire King had survived 8 centuries by understanding when retreat was tactical and when it became suicide, and Elena's psychological profile suggested she would soon reach a breaking point that could destroy them both if not carefully managed. Their partnership had evolved beyond mere survival cooperation into something deeper and more complex, a connection that surprised them both with its intensity and inevitability. Elena found herself watching Alexander during quiet moments in their hiding places, seeing past his supernatural nature to the profound loneliness that 800 years of persecution had carved into his soul like scar tissue. The Vampire King had learned to exist without hope, to survive without connection, to endure without purpose beyond the simple biological imperative to continue existing. But Elena's courage had awakened possibilities he had forgotten could exist. Alexander recognized in Elena a moral clarity that had been rare even in his human life, a willingness to sacrifice personal safety for abstract principles that reminded him why he had once believed in causes worth dying for. Neither spoke of the growing attraction between them, their desperate circumstances making such conversations feel like luxury they could not afford, but both understood that they were fighting for something more than individual survival. The weight of shared danger and mutual dependence had forged bonds that might survive even if they did not, creating a connection that transcended the species barrier that should have made understanding impossible. Elena's dreams were filled with amber eyes and gentle hands, while Alexander found himself planning not just for escape, but for a future that might include protecting someone whose welfare had become more important than his own. Their relationship existed in stolen moments between safe houses, quiet conversations in the darkness while they waited for dawn. The simple comfort of human contact that reminded them both what they were fighting to preserve. Dr. Sarah Kim contacted them through Father Mihail's network on their 3rd day as fugitives. Her credentials as a Department of Justice attorney investigating supernatural rights violations, providing the first hope they had experienced since fleeing Elena's apartment. Kim had been building a case against DSA corruption for 18 months, documenting a pattern of illegal detentions and suspicious deaths that suggested systematic abuse of authority. But she lacked concrete evidence that could survive scrutiny in federal court. Elena and Alexander's story provided the missing pieces of a puzzle Kim had been trying to solve. Their direct experience with Morrison's operation offering testimony that could expose the conspiracy if they survived long enough to deliver it. The attorney explained that Morrison's personal files would contain communications with his private military contractors, financial records showing illegal payments, and possibly even fragments of the project census registry that could prove the scope of the trafficking operation. Obtaining those files would require infiltrating the federal building, a task that seemed impossible until Kim proposed using Elena as bait to draw Morrison out of his secure environment. The plan required Elena to surrender herself while claiming to possess information about other supernatural refugees, a lie designed to make her valuable enough to interrogate personally rather than simply eliminate. While Morrison focused on extracting intelligence from Elena, Alexander would use his supernatural abilities to penetrate the federal building's security and steal the evidence files from Morrison's office. The timing would have to be perfect, with Elena maintaining her deception long enough for Alexander to complete his mission while avoiding interrogation techniques that might break her before the Vampire King could effect a rescue. Kim provided them with detailed building schematics and security protocols, her inside knowledge of federal procedures making the impossible merely suicidal, but the plan represented their only chance to expose Morrison's conspiracy before it consumed them completely. Father Mihail's capture changed everything. The elderly priest's disappearance discovered when he failed to make his scheduled communication check that evening. Elena and Alexander found signs of struggle in the church basement, overturned furniture, and blood spatters that told the story of a man who had fought despite knowing resistance was futile. Under enhanced interrogation techniques that had been refined over decades of supernatural persecution, Father Mihail revealed the location of their current safe house, his courage finally breaking under physical and psychological pressure that would have destroyed weaker men within hours. Morrison's team was en route to their position, estimated arrival in less than 60 minutes, leaving Elena and Alexander with impossible choices and no time to consider alternatives. The safe house was a converted warehouse in an industrial district that offered multiple escape routes, but no possibility of sustained defense against a federal assault team equipped with supernatural containment technology. Elena's training and counter-interrogation techniques told her that Father Mihail would have resisted as long as humanly possible, his capture and breakdown representing Morrison's growing desperation to end their flight before it attracted unwanted attention from Kim's allies in the Department of Justice. Alexander's supernatural senses detected the approach of vehicles still miles away, their electromagnetic signatures indicating the kind of specialized equipment used for hunting supernatural beings in urban environments. The Vampire King could escape alone, using his abilities to vanish into Seattle's underground infrastructure where no human agency could follow. But leaving Elena behind would condemn her to interrogation that would extract every secret she possessed before ending in her death. Elena understood the tactical situation as clearly as Alexander did, her knowledge of DSA protocols telling her that captured assets were never allowed to survive long enough to become liabilities. But she also knew that Dr. Kim's plan represented their only chance to strike back at Morrison's conspiracy before it expanded beyond their ability to stop. They decided to implement the infiltration mission immediately, using Morrison's expectation of their panic to mask their true intentions as they prepared to walk into the most heavily defended federal facility in the Pacific Northwest. Elena would surrender herself at the federal building's main entrance, claiming to possess information about supernatural refugee networks that Morrison needed to complete his operation, while Alexander used the distraction to infiltrate the building through ventilation systems that his supernatural abilities would allow him to navigate. The timing was crucial, with Elena's deception needing to last exactly long enough for Alexander to locate and steal Morrison's files while avoiding security systems designed specifically to detect and contain supernatural intruders. Elena armed herself with enough genuine intelligence about Father Mihail's network to make her initial story credible while holding back critical details that could be used to bargain for time during the interrogation process. Alexander memorized the building schematics and security protocols Kim had provided, planning multiple infiltration routes and escape paths, while knowing that his supernatural nature would make him vulnerable to detection systems he might not even recognize. Their partnership had brought them to this moment of ultimate risk, where success would expose Morrison's conspiracy, while failure would result in their deaths and the continued persecution of thousands of supernatural beings who depended on their courage. Elena kissed Alexander goodbye in the shadow of an abandoned overpass, their first and possibly last moment of physical intimacy, carrying the weight of everything they could not say, before walking toward the federal building to surrender herself to the enemy. The Vampire King watched her disappear into the Seattle morning, his ancient heart breaking with emotions he had thought lost forever, before beginning his own approach to a building that represented 8 centuries of institutional hatred made manifest in steel and glass. Elena's footsteps echoed against the polished marble floor of the federal building's lobby, each step carrying her closer to a confrontation that would either expose Morrison's conspiracy or end in her death within the sterile walls of Floor 13. Security guards processed her surrender with professional efficiency, their metal detectors and biometric scanners confirming her identity, while she maintained the facade of a desperate informant seeking protection from supernatural forces she could no longer control. The elevator ride to Morrison's domain felt like ascending to her own execution. The hydraulic smoothness of the machinery carrying her toward an interrogation room where her psychological training would be tested against techniques refined through decades of breaking supernatural allies and human collaborators alike. Morrison waited for her in a room designed to strip away dignity and hope, its mirrored walls and surgical lighting creating an environment where truth became a luxury that only cooperation could purchase. Elena entered the space with carefully calculated fear, playing the role of someone whose nerve had finally broken under pressure, while her mind catalogued every detail that might prove useful if she survived the next few hours. Morrison's satisfaction was palpable as he studied her across the metal table, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the confidence of a predator who had finally cornered prey that had led him on an exhausting chase through Seattle's shadows. Elena began feeding him false information about Father Mikhail's network, describing safe houses that existed only in her imagination, while mixing enough truth about supernatural refugee patterns to make her lies credible under scrutiny. She spoke of Romanian Orthodox churches throughout the Pacific Northwest that sheltered vampire families, of document forgers in Portland who specialized in supernatural identity papers, of underground railroads that moved lycanthropes and shapeshifters across the Canadian border to safety. Morrison's questions grew more specific and more urgent as Elena's fabricated intelligence painted a picture of supernatural resistance far more extensive than his previous investigations had revealed. Meanwhile, 3 floors above their psychological duel, Alexander moved through the federal building's infrastructure like shadow-made flesh, his supernatural senses navigating ventilation systems and maintenance corridors that no human could traverse without detection. The Vampire King's 8 centuries of survival had taught him patience and precision, qualities that served him now as he avoided motion sensors and electromagnetic monitoring systems designed specifically to capture beings like himself. Morrison's office occupied a corner of the building with panoramic views of Elliott Bay, its placement and security measures marking it as the domain of someone with power that extended far beyond normal bureaucratic authority. Alexander's supernatural speed allowed him to crack the office's electronic locks before their security protocols could register his presence, his movements too fast for the cameras to capture clear images of his infiltration. The files he discovered confirmed Elena's worst fears about the scope of Morrison's conspiracy, documents detailing contracts with private military companies in 17 countries and financial records showing payments that totaled millions of dollars over the past decade. Morrison had not limited his operations to simple supernatural trafficking, but had created an international market for persecution that treated sentient beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and eliminated according to the whims of foreign governments and corporate interests. The list of supernatural beings already captured and sold read like a catalog of horror, hundreds of names with brief descriptions of their abilities and the prices their unique characteristics had commanded in markets that existed beyond any legal oversight or moral consideration. Alexander's perfect memory absorbed every detail, while his hands photographed documents with the precision of someone who understood that evidence was useless unless it survived to reach legitimate authorities. The safe containing Morrison's most sensitive materials stood behind a painting of Mount Rainier, its sophisticated locks and electromagnetic shielding indicating contents valuable enough to justify extraordinary security measures. In the interrogation room, Elena felt Morrison's psychological pressure intensifying as her stalling tactics began to show strain under his professional expertise. The agent's training in enhanced interrogation had been refined through years of practice on subjects whose supernatural resilience allowed him to explore techniques that would kill normal humans within minutes. Elena drew upon her own background in counterinterrogation, using breathing exercises and mental compartmentalization to maintain her deception while Morrison's questions grew more invasive and threatening. She turned his psychological weapons against him by expressing curiosity about his methods, playing the role of someone impressed by his sophistication while gathering intelligence about his true plans. Morrison's ego responded to Elena's apparent admiration, his professional pride overriding tactical caution as he described the scope of his family's three-generation conspiracy with barely concealed satisfaction. Elena learned that Morrison planned to retire after completing Project Census, his share of the supernatural trafficking profits, enough to fund a comfortable exile in countries without extradition treaties with the United States. The complete registry represented his final score, a comprehensive database that could be sold to multiple buyers simultaneously while generating enough chaos to cover his escape from America and the inevitable investigation that would follow. Morrison revealed that the encrypted drive containing the complete supernatural registry was stored in his office safe, the same location where Alexander was currently working to defeat security systems that protected the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy. Elena's shock at this information was genuine enough to convince Morrison that his revelation had broken her psychological defenses, encouraging him to continue describing plans that painted him as the mastermind of systematic genocide disguised as law enforcement. The building's alarm system activated with piercing intensity that cut through steel and concrete, emergency lights flooding corridors with red warning illumination as security protocols designed for supernatural containment began sealing exits and activating detection systems. Alexander had successfully retrieved the encrypted drive and Morrison's evidence files, but his presence had finally been detected by sensors sophisticated enough to differentiate between human and supernatural electromagnetic signatures. The Vampire King found himself trapped within a building that had been specifically designed to contain beings with his abilities, silver-lined barriers descending from hidden ceiling compartments, while sonic frequencies calibrated to disorient supernatural senses filled the air with nauseating harmonics. Elena used her knowledge of federal emergency protocols to guide Alexander toward the interrogation level, her memory of bureaucratic procedures allowing her to predict which corridors would remain accessible during lockdown and which routes would be blocked by containment systems. Morrison realized too late that his prisoner's apparent cooperation had been an elaborate deception. Her questions about his methods designed not to flatter his ego, but to extract tactical intelligence that could be used against him. The agent's fury transformed him from professional interrogator into something more primitive and dangerous, his family's generational hatred for supernatural beings overriding the careful calculation that had kept their conspiracy hidden for nearly a century. Elena grabbed the metal chair she had been sitting in and swung it with desperate strength, the impact against Morrison's skull buying her precious seconds to reach the interrogation room's emergency release, while alarms continued screaming throughout the building. The federal building's atrium became a battlefield as Morrison's security team cornered Elena and Alexander in the only space large enough for supernatural speed and strength to provide tactical advantages. Elena armed herself with a fire extinguisher whose chemical contents could temporarily blind their attackers, while Alexander moved with inhuman grace that made him nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons. Morrison appeared with blood streaming from his head wound and a service pistol in his hand, his professional demeanor replaced by the raw hatred that had motivated 3 generations of his family's persecution of supernatural beings. The Vampire King's supernatural abilities allowed him to deflect gunfire and disable armed agents with minimal violence, his centuries of experience in combat providing skills that Morrison's team had trained to counter but never actually faced in real confrontation. Elena coordinated their defense using her understanding of federal tactical procedures, predicting her enemy's movements while creating opportunities for Alexander to neutralize threats without killing agents who might be following orders rather than participating willingly in Morrison's conspiracy. Dr. Kim arrived with federal marshals just as Morrison pressed his pistol against Elena's temple, the Department of Justice attorney having used Elena's surrender as cover for her own investigation that had finally gathered enough evidence to obtain arrest warrants. The standoff lasted only seconds before Morrison realized that his conspiracy had been exposed beyond his ability to contain or control, the arrival of legitimate federal authority, marking the end of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for 3 generations. Morrison's arrest was complicated by his attempt to destroy the evidence drive using electromagnetic pulses from emergency equipment. His desperate efforts only partially successful before federal marshals subdued him with force that left him unconscious and bleeding on the atrium floor. The encrypted drive survived Morrison's sabotage attempts, but Elena and Alexander discovered that the agent had maintained backup copies of critical intelligence with allies still embedded throughout the DSA hierarchy. They had won a significant victory by exposing Morrison's personal operation and securing evidence of international supernatural trafficking, but the larger conspiracy extended beyond any single individual and would require continued vigilance to completely eliminate. Elena found herself in federal protective custody while investigators worked to decode Morrison's files, her testimony crucial to building cases against the network of collaborators who had enabled decades of systematic persecution. Alexander disappeared into the supernatural underground that Dr. Kim's investigation had revealed, his knowledge of the complete registry making him both a valuable witness and a permanent target for those who profited from supernatural suffering. Their partnership had achieved more than either had believed possible when Elena first whispered her warning in Café Europa, exposing corruption that reached the highest levels of government, while demonstrating that supernatural beings and their human allies could work together to challenge systems designed to destroy them. The war against supernatural persecution would continue in courtrooms and congressional hearings, through media investigations and international tribunals that would spend years unraveling the full scope of Morrison's conspiracy and the criminal network it had served. Elena and Alexander had struck the first decisive blow against enemies who had operated in darkness for nearly a century, their courage creating precedents that would inspire others to stand against institutionalized hatred disguised as legitimate authority. The Vampire King and the document forger turned waitress had proven that even ancient evils could be defeated when people chose to risk everything for principles that transcended species and nationality. Morrison's arrest marked the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape supernatural law enforcement in America. But Elena knew that their real victory lay not in destroying one conspiracy, but in demonstrating that cooperation between human and supernatural communities could overcome any force arrayed against them. The courtroom where Morrison faced judgment felt different from the sterile interrogation rooms where he had broken so many supernatural beings over the years. Its mahogany panels and constitutional symbols representing ideals that his family had perverted for nearly a century. Dr. Kim presented the evidence with prosecutorial precision that left no room for doubt about the scope of the conspiracy, Morrison's own files documenting decades of illegal trafficking, while his encrypted communications revealed an international network that had treated sentient beings as commodities in markets that existed beyond any moral oversight. The registry contained over 15,000 names, each entry representing a supernatural being whose location, abilities, and vulnerabilities had been cataloged for potential exploitation by buyers who saw persecution as a profitable business opportunity. Morrison's conviction on charges of human trafficking, conspiracy, and violations of the Supernatural Rights Act carried a life sentence that would ensure he never again profited from the suffering of those he had sworn to protect. But the damage his family had inflicted over 3 generations could not be undone by any judicial proceeding. Elena testified for 6 hours about the Morrison conspiracy's methods and scope, her detailed knowledge of document forgery and supernatural identification protocols, providing evidence that connected seemingly isolated incidents into a comprehensive pattern of systematic persecution. Alexander's testimony was given in closed session due to security concerns, his perfect memory allowing him to reconstruct conversations and events from decades past that corroborated the documentary evidence Dr. Kim had assembled. The Vampire King's legal status was not only confirmed, but elevated to permanent sanctuary, with protections that could not be revoked by bureaucratic manipulation, his case becoming a precedent that strengthened the rights of all supernatural refugees who had sought safety in America. Elena's asylum application was approved within weeks of Morrison's arrest, her cooperation in exposing government corruption, earning her legitimate papers that replaced the false identity she had maintained for 3 years in Seattle. Dr. Kim offered Elena a position with the Department of Justice's new Supernatural Rights Division, using her expertise in document analysis and her understanding of persecution tactics to help other refugees navigate legal systems that had been compromised by decades of institutionalized discrimination. Elena accepted the role with enthusiasm that surprised her, discovering that her skills could be used to protect rather than hunt, to build sanctuary rather than destroy it, to create hope rather than spread fear. Her first cases involved supernatural beings who had been victimized by Morrison's network, families torn apart by trafficking operations that had disguised genocide as law enforcement while profiting from the systematic elimination of entire communities. Alexander found purpose in working with Father Mihail and the Orthodox Church network to create better protection systems for vulnerable supernatural beings, his centuries of survival experience proving invaluable in designing security protocols that could resist both government persecution and private exploitation. The Vampire King's reputation within supernatural communities had been transformed from that of a reclusive survivor to an active protector, his willingness to risk exposure for the greater good, inspiring others to emerge from hiding and contribute to collective defense efforts. Elena and Alexander's relationship evolved from partnership born of desperation into something deeper and more complex, their shared trauma creating bonds that transcended the species barrier that should have made understanding impossible. They discovered that love could grow in the spaces between crisis and calm, in quiet moments when survival was not the only consideration, in the simple pleasure of planning for a future that extended beyond the next safe house or the next narrow escape. Elena learned to see past Alexander's supernatural nature to the man who had chosen courage over safety when faced with impossible odds, while he recognized in her a moral clarity that had remained uncompromised despite years of working within systems designed to corrupt those who served them. Their courtship proceeded with the careful deliberation of people who had learned that happiness was fragile and precious, each shared meal and stolen kiss carrying weight that casual relationships could never achieve. Father Mihail's church basement was transformed from emergency communications center into community gathering space, its sophisticated equipment repurposed for legal aid and document assistance rather than counter-surveillance and escape coordination. The elderly priest had survived his interrogation with dignity intact, his faith in justice validated by Morrison's conviction and his network strengthened by the exposure of corruption that had threatened supernatural communities for generations. Elena spent evenings at the church helping newly arrived refugees understand their legal rights and navigate immigration procedures that had been simplified by reforms Dr. Kim championed in Congress. Her fluency in multiple languages and her understanding of bureaucratic systems proving invaluable to families seeking sanctuary from persecution in their homelands. Alexander's presence at these gatherings initially caused nervousness among supernatural beings who remembered when vampire kings ruled through fear rather than protection, but his gentle manner and genuine concern for their welfare gradually won acceptance and eventually gratitude from those he helped. The rebuilt Café Europa reopened 6 months after Morrison's arrest, its familiar location chosen specifically to demonstrate that supernatural beings would not be driven from places where they had found community and belonging. Father Mihail had purchased the building using donations from grateful families whose lives had been saved by the exposure of Morrison's conspiracy, transforming the simple cafe into a community center that offered legal aid, document services, and cultural programs for for both supernatural and human residents of Seattle's diverse neighborhoods. Elena and Alexander often spent afternoons at their old corner table, the same spot where their partnership had begun with a whispered warning that had ultimately saved thousands of lives. Elena taught Alexander to read modern immigration forms and federal regulations, his perfect memory absorbing legal complexities, while her patience guided him through bureaucratic language that had evolved considerably since his last encounter with American paperwork in the 1970s. Alexander shared Romanian folk songs with Elena, his voice carrying melodies that predated her existence by centuries, while she learned lyrics that connected her to cultural traditions she had abandoned when fleeing Bucharest years earlier. Their relationship had found rhythm in these ordinary moments, love expressed through shared purpose and quiet intimacy, rather than grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Elena's hand rested naturally over Alexander's as they worked together, her warmth a constant reminder that he was no longer alone, while his presence provided her with security she had never known before meeting him. The contrast between their current peace and their desperate beginning made every moment of normalcy feel like a victory against forces that had tried to destroy them. Every shared smile a rebellion against those who believed supernatural beings and their human allies could not coexist safely. The young woman who entered the cafe on a rainy Tuesday afternoon moved with grace that immediately caught Elena's attention, her ancient eyes and impossible accent marking her as someone whose appearance did not match her true age or origins. Vera introduced herself casually while sliding a folded newspaper across their table, her finger pointing to a headline that made Elena's blood turn cold. Missing Persons Reports, Spike in Portland's Supernatural Community. The article described disappearances that followed patterns disturbingly similar to those Morrison had used in Seattle, suggesting that his arrest had not ended the conspiracy, but merely forced it to relocate and adapt to new circumstances. Elena and Alexander exchanged glances that carried entire conversations about duty and danger, about the peace they had found, and the responsibility they could not abandon when others faced threats they were uniquely qualified to address. Vera revealed herself as a 400-year-old vampire who had survived the Romanian purges of the 1600s before establishing herself in Portland's underground supernatural community, her resources and connections providing intelligence about threats that official channels had not yet recognized. Something was hunting supernatural beings along the West Coast with sophistication that suggested government training and resources, using forged documents and manipulated federal systems to operate with the same impunity Morrison had enjoyed before his exposure. The evidence Vera presented included federal badges whose forgery techniques matched those Elena had identified in Morrison's operation, suggesting that his network had survived his arrest by transferring operations to backup cells that had remained hidden during the initial investigation. Elena's expertise in document analysis and Alexander's encyclopedic knowledge of persecution tactics were needed again, their hard-won experience representing the only realistic hope of stopping a renewed campaign of systematic elimination before it achieved the scale Morrison had envisioned. The false federal badge Vera slid across their table was a perfect forgery that would have fooled anyone except someone with Elena's specialized training, its subtle imperfections revealing manufacturing techniques that suggested the same equipment and expertise Morrison had used to create documents for his trafficking operation. Elena studied the badge while her mind raced through the implications of what Vera's intelligence suggested. Morrison's arrest had been a tactical victory rather than a strategic defeat, disrupting one node of a network that had been designed to survive exactly this kind of exposure. Alexander's supernatural senses detected no deception from Vera, her desperate sincerity convincing him that the threats she described were genuine and immediate, rather than manipulation designed to draw them back into danger they had already escaped. Elena looked into Alexander's amber eyes and saw her own determination reflected there, the shared understanding that their fight for supernatural refugees had only begun with Morrison's conviction and would continue until the entire network of persecution was dismantled completely. Their love had been forged in crisis and tested by separation, but it had also been strengthened by shared purpose that transcended personal happiness to encompass responsibility for those who could not protect themselves. Elena's hand covered Alexander's on the cafe table as they studied the forged documents together, their fingers intertwining with the natural intimacy of partners who had learned to trust each other completely while facing impossible odds. The ordinary setting of the rebuilt cafe contrasted sharply with the extraordinary nature of their calling, love and purpose intertwined in ways that made both stronger than either could have been alone. Elena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded action, her skills awakening from the comfortable dormancy of legitimate employment to meet challenges that required everything she had learned about document forgery and bureaucratic manipulation. Alexander's ancient instincts responded to the promise of renewed conflict with anticipation rather than dread, his centuries of survival experience finally harnessed for protection rather than mere endurance. They had stopped Morrison and exposed his conspiracy, but the larger war against supernatural persecution would continue in Portland and beyond, wherever hatred disguised itself as justice and profit was extracted from suffering. Elena and Alexander rose from their table with shared resolve that needed no discussion, their partnership stronger for having been tested, and their love deeper for having survived crisis together. The fight for supernatural refugees was far from over, but they faced it together with skills proven in battle and commitment, strengthened by everything they had already overcome in service of principles that transcended species and nationality.